I'm a member of the Committee on Homeland Security as well as a special task force on foreign fighters, and as part of that, we spend a lot of time studying terrorism and the terrorist attacks against this nation. And one thing that I have seen that is consistent about these terrorist attacks is that they are attacking us not because of who we are. Most of them don't even know our names. They may not know our families or what we believe. And it may as well be the case in Charleston as I know it was in Garland, Texas, and the attacks there, they didn't even know their victims. But what I have seen of these attacks of terrorism is they're attacks about what we stand for, and that's freedom. In Garland, Texas, it was an attack on the First Amendment, our freedom of speech. Last night, it was an attack on the most fundamental right that our founding fathers gave to us, and that was our freedom of religion, a right that was, as they said, was given to us by God and could not be taken away. I've had the opportunity since being in Congress a short amount of time, and it's more than an opportunity, it's really a privilege to take constituents as they come to the Capitol here and take them on tours. And as I walk down the halls of this building, and I point out the statues of Thomas Jefferson that we have right outside the chamber, or even as I stand here, the image of Moses is looking at me as he's looking over the chamber. As I see the statues of our founding fathers, they have left us reminders of why we are here. And as we're getting close to the great anniversary festival of the birth of this nation, I think it is imperative, it is important that we as a body are reminded of why we are here. I just want to speak briefly about two phrases that you can find in Washington, D.C. that reminds us not only of why we're here, but what it takes to preserve the freedom that we have been given. Mr. Speaker, as I walk down the aisle to come to this podium, I just glanced up above the rostrum where you're standing. And I see four words: in God we trust. That's one of the phrases that my eyes often go to as I'm sitting in this chamber as we are debating bills. And I reflect back on why do we have that phrase here? Well, it also goes back to another phrase that I have seen recently as I was taking a tour of the mall outside this building where we have the museums of the heritage of this nation, but there's also a building there, the National Archives, that inside of that building are the documents of freedom, the most hallowed of all of our documents, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and then that we hold the most sacred, the one that is most requested by visitors to this nation's capital to see, and that's the Declaration of Independence. And in that declaration, our founding fathers expressed what they believed that this nation would be one day. It was their vision, it was their faith, it was their philosophy about this new nation. They were revolutionary ideas that they brought forth because it was the first time in the history of mankind that a government existed where the emphasis was on the freedom of the individual, empowering the individual. Every other government in the face of the earth before this had focused its attention upon a group, a collective, whether it was by their race or their religion or aristocracy or their family line. But our founding fathers sensed something different, that if we empower the individual, if we recognize the rights that God has given them and we give them the freedom to excel and exceed, then our nation as a whole would excel. They believed that these rights were important to be protected. The right to speak freely, the right to have ideas, the right to pursue happiness, the right to pursue commerce, and the right to worship without fear of oppression from the government. These were revolutionary ideas. But they also knew that they had a challenge. Because of these revolutionary ideas, they knew that they would not be well accepted by other governments because it threatened the power base of those governments. In fact, they knew they would have to take on the most powerful military force in the history of the entire world if they were ever going to see these ideas come to fruition. Now think about that. This ragtag rabble of Washington soldiers would have to take on the most powerful military force in the history of the world. It was an impossible task. They understood that. But, Mr. Speaker, that phrase that's in marble above the rostrum reflects one of those two key phrases. Because in the last line of the Declaration of Independence, our founding fathers wrote these words, and in support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. You see, in God we trust was the first element that they identified that we must have if we were going to preserve this freedom that they were fighting for. Now, outside the National Archives, where that declaration is still on display, the words, eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. Eternal vigilance is the price of freedom. You see, that's the second phrase that I think we must be reminded of today. The second part of that last line of the Declaration of Independence says we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. You see, freedom is not free, and it is held and is protected at a price. Just recently, I was given the opportunity to travel to the beaches of Normandy. And I stood up on the sands of Omaha Beach. And I started reflecting upon the price that was paid that day for our freedom and our liberty. I brought back a little bit of the sand from the beach, as my dad was in World War II and served in that theater. And as I sat at home right around Memorial Day, I was looking at that jar of sand and I started thinking, what if these sands could speak? What would they say? What would they tell us in this august body here? What would they tell the people of our nation if that sand could speak? You see, that sand absorbed the blood of American patriots who had the courage to step off of those Higgins boats into the line of fire. And I've wondered, why would they do that? Knowing that more than likely they would never return back home. You see, that sand absorbed the blood of these patriots. The sand also maybe be able to tell us of the last words that were spoken by some of these as they drew their last breath after giving their lives, their very lives, for our freedom. Would they tell of the name of a father or daughter or mother as they cried out their last cry of hope? Would they tell the name of a sweetheart which they will never embrace, or a brother or a sister or a child that they will never see? But as I started thinking about it, I started realizing that sand held the DNA of these soldiers. Not just the DNA of the soldiers, but the DNA of our entire nation. And I believe today, Mr. Speaker, that if that sand could tell us anything today in this body is to remember what they died for. And I believe if that sand could speak today, that sand would tell us these words: this is why we died, because we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to ensure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. As we are nearing that celebration, we celebrate 239 years of the birth of this nation. I call upon the members of this body to once again reflect on why we are here, and that's to preserve freedom. Mr. Speaker, I thank you for this opportunity to speak, and I yield back the balance of my time.